Hello, class. It's Dr. Maxwell DiCarlo. We're in week 7. We are going to be talking about solution-focused brief therapy. And to get us started, I want to share this video that I think is really helpful and will help you understand sort of the transition from problem solving to understanding what it looks like when we start working with clients to find solutions on what's going well, what we are moving towards as far as positive solutions as opposed to just focusing on problems. So here it is.
I'm DeWitt Jones. 20 years I worked for National Geographic, photographing stories all over the globe, creating extraordinary visions. I learned a great deal from these visions about society, about geography, about people. But the vision that most changed my life was not photographing. It was an attitude. Perspective that exists at the core of the geographic. A vision so simple, yet so profound. A vision I'd like to share with you. Celebrate right with the world. We all have teachers in our lives, mentors that show us what's possible. The National Geographic was one of those for me. Maybe it was for many of you. I used to read it at night, and even after my parents told me to turn out the light and go to sleep, I wouldn't do it. I'd get a flashlight, I'd hide under the covers, I'd stay up and stare at those photos in that little yellow book. Pictures that showed me the possibilities the world had to offer. I never thought I'd work for them. I never thought I'd shoot for them. They began to influence my life long before I even knew I was a photographer. Why? Because they had a wonderful vision. What they charged me with every time they sent me out was to celebrate what was right with the world rather than wallow in what was wrong with it. That's why we keep them. We all do. I mean, it's a national sacrilege to throw away a geographic because they celebrate what's right with the world. And nobody wants to throw that away. When I was growing up, I used to hold that maxim. I won't believe it until I see it. Yet the more I shot for the geographic, the more I realized that I had it backwards. That the way it really works is I won't see it till I believe it. That's the way life works. Well, I believed it. I believed the vision of the geographic, and the more I did, the more I'd see it in everything. They'd send me out to places I'd never been. I believed there would be beautiful landscapes to photograph. They'd appear. I believed those landscapes would be full of wonderful people. They'd be there. I begin every assignment, every day, every shot, trying to celebrate what was right with the situation rather than what was wrong with it. When I started, I had no idea how powerful that vision would be, how much it would change my life. But vision controls our perception, and our perception becomes our reality. Celebrating what's right with the world. It was a vision that had purpose and passion for everybody at the geographic. Do you have a vision like that? And not just for your organization, for yourself. A vision that you can put into 6 words. And every morning when you say those words, you say, yes, that's what you're doing, whatever it is you're doing. Because when the vision is clear, then passion and creativity are there as well. I know that. I know that because I lived it. All of a sudden, I wasn't just looking at those pictures on the printed page. I was there, and what an incredible place there was. From the highest mountains, to rivers drenched in sunlight, to rainbows and seashells. Everywhere I looked, there would be amazing beauty for me to photograph. And in the geographics view, man was an integral part of that beauty. Not something separate, just as beautiful, just as magical as anything else on the planet. And when I celebrated the best in people, I could see that. I could see it in the faces of those at work, or the body language of those at play, those in their youth, or in their age. Can you believe this guy? I thought this was going to be a good shot before he smiled. I would see it. I would see that light that shines not on us, but from within us. From within us when we trust enough to let it out. It was the same light I'd seen in nature that didn't have to trust to expose itself, but just graced us every day with the delicacy of a flower or the fading light on half-dome. Yet the more I celebrated the beauty of the world, the more I found a conflict growing within me between the geographics paradigm and the worldview that I'd been taught since I was a child. My intellectual paradigm. You all know it. The law of the jungle, eat or be eaten, my win is your loss, second place is the first loser. We live in that paradigm all the time. A world based on fear and scarcity and competition. It's true if you choose to believe it. But it wasn't what nature was showing me. Nature was showing me incredible beauty standing just beyond the rat race saying, hello, hello. All was there if I was open enough to see it. I mean, come on, nature never stood in front of a forest and said, there is one great photograph hidden here. One photographer will find it and the rest of you will be hopeless losers. Nature said, how many rolls you got to win? Bring it on. Bring it on, I'll fill them up. I'll fill them up with layers of beauty and possibility beyond anything you've ever imagined. Right down to my tiniest seed. Do we choose to see those possibilities? Do we truly believe that they're there? Perception controls our reality, and if we don't believe it, we won't see it. I remember one time they sent me up to the Selkirk Mountains of British Columbia, and I came upon this great field of dandelions. But, I just wasn't into it, and I started to say, the light isn't right. I'll come back tomorrow. We've all been there. It happens all the time, at home, at work. I just can't get into it. I'll do it tomorrow. And then tomorrow turns into next week, and by the time I got back there, no more dandelions. I had puffballs. That wasn't the way I planned it. And I was just about to leave when a little voice inside me said, come on, DeWitt, what's here to celebrate? I know it wasn't how you planned it, but what's right with the situation? Where are the possibilities? And before I knew it, I was into puffballs, 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 over the puffballs, and eye level with the puffballs, under the puffballs, looking at them from every angle until, whoa, oh, that's what I found. It was there. It seemed it was always there if I was open enough to see it. The more I shot for the geographic, the more I realized what a powerful force our vision can be. As I celebrated what was right with the world, I began to build a vision of possibility. Not scarcity, possibility. Always another right answer. A vision that showed me that no matter how bleak and desolate, no matter how dry and devoid of possibilities a situation might seem, that if I was open to it, I could always find a perspective. In this case, just by dropping down in that crack in the slick rock and looking back. A perspective that would transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. How open to possibility does our vision allow us to be? Open. I mean, really open, even when we think we know what the answer will be. I was shooting recently in Marine World, and I'd gotten the shots of the whales and the dolphins, and I'm heading back to the car, and I saw this kid standing in front of the dancing fountains. Dancing fountains, you know, where the water comes out of one, goes up, and goes into the other, and up, and into the next one. And this kid had his hand on the source. And he was ready, and so was I. And he was waiting, and so was I. And I knew what that answer would be, and I nailed it. But I'm not putting on the brakes. I'm not taking my eye off the viewfinder. I'm staying open. Because if I didn't, if I thought this was it, I never would have seen this one. Celebrating what's right with the world. It not only keeps us open to possibilities, it gives us energy. When I'm setting up a shot, I always begin by saying, what's exciting me? What's here to celebrate? What's the very best this shot has to offer? And then I try and enhance that and get rid of everything else. Instead of starting out, as we so often do, by griping about what's wrong with the situation, what's right with it? Because by celebrating the best, that allows us to fall in love with it. That connects us with our passion. That emancipates the energy. By celebrating what's right, we find the energy to fix what's wrong. As Michelangelo once wrote, I saw an angel in the stone and carved to set it free. The right vision. It keeps us open to possibilities, it gives us energy, and it makes us much more accepting of change. Change. Well, as a photographer, I pray for change. I get down on my knees and beg the weather or the wind or the light to do its thing. It was the status quo that would make the pictures boring and redundant. In fact, I began to see that the very thing that so often frightens us today, that awesome change curve we hear so much about, the phenomenal rate of change in our society, it's really my ally. In fact, if I viewed it from just a slightly different perspective, it wasn't a change curve at all. It was a possibility curve. A possibility curve. Can I see it? I knew from my photography that it was true. Change is possibility, and the times of most change always hold the most potential. So we live in an accelerating possibility curve. Perhaps we can't control it, but we can learn to ride it. A surfer on a wave or a bird on a thermal. We use its power to take us where we want to go. To live in uncertainty and yet act with confidence. Now that's something I can celebrate. The more I did, the more I took all my skills and used them to ride that wave of possibility, the more I found in my photography and in my life that the difference between a good frame and a great frame is measured in millimeters, not miles. Good frame, morning glory on a beach in Maui, 10 inches closer. Great frame. Good frame, a cowboy in Bryce Canyon, 30 feet away in the doorway of a barn. Great frame. Good frame, sunset on the Golden Gate Bridge with the new moon rising. How could it get any better? 15 minutes later. Great frame. When we believe it, we'll see it. The power of vision is extraordinary. It transforms the way we look at the world. It can take us from flapping in the middle of the flock to soaring to heights we've never dreamed of. But we have to be willing to trust it, to come out to our edge. Because it's here on the edge that we find the winds to take us higher. And it's not just the external edges that we have to test. It's the internal ones as well. If we're going to really learn to soar, we have to know ourselves as well as we know our craft. I realized that if I was going to take it higher in my own life, I had to spend time not just with what I do, but with who I am. Boy, that's a lot harder. At least it was for me. Discovering who I was and being comfortable with it, a lot harder than taking a photograph. And yet I knew that was the move from good frame to great frame. That was the edge I'd have to press. That edge in each of our lives between success and significance. That subtle edge between being the best in the world and being the best for the world. Not an easy shift. But every time that I'd lose faith that I might ever be able to make it, I'd meet someone who had. And they'd serve as a beacon to show me it was possible. I met such a person on Scotland's Outer Hebrides. Her name was Marion Campbell, and she was the finest weaver in all of Scotland. She was a national treasure. She'd been cited by the Queen, and she lived in the tiny town of Clockerpool. And I had to photograph her, and I went to her house, I knocked on the door, she came out, lovely woman. And she said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm from National Geographic, and I want to photograph you." And she said, "Wait, my brother is very sick upstairs. He may be dying, and I'm taking care of him." And I felt like a complete idiot, I mean, why? I began to apologize. I backed off, and she stopped me, and she said, wait, give me an hour, and I'll be ready." And she closed the door. And I wandered around the village thinking of the extraordinary presence of this woman. Why, when her brother was dying, would she give me time? And then I heard the hand shuttle being thrown across her loom, and I found her in her weaving shed, lit only by the light of the window. And she showed me the yarn that she'd spun by hand. And she told me how she'd gone into the fields and scraped the lichens off the rock to make her dyes. And I was still nervous and embarrassed. I took a few quick photographs, and I said, thank you, fine, I got it. And I started to leave. And again, she stopped me. And she took me into her house. And she'd put out biscuits, and she'd made tea. And she wouldn't eat till I had eaten. She invited me into her living room, and she stoked the peat fire, and we sat together. She talked quietly and simply, and I kept thinking I was in the presence of a great sage, and I was waiting for some great gift of wisdom. And finally I said, "What do you think about when you weave?" And she said, "I wonder if I'll run out of thread." It wasn't exactly what I thought I'd hear, And she must have seen my discomfort, because she smiled at me and she cocked her head and she said, "When I weave, I weave." And in my own mind, I heard, when I weave, I weave. When I photograph, I photograph. When I serve, I serve. When I celebrate, I celebrate. There's no use walking anywhere to preach unless you're walking as you're preaching. And that evening, through her actions and her words, Marion Campbell showed me what it might be like to soar. She was who she was, with discipline, with grace, with total lack of ego. She was a thermal rider. Not just the best in the world, but the best for the world. Could I do that? Could I trust my own values and vision enough to step out beyond my own edge? To find a new balance in my life, not one of limitation, but one of possibility. Not an either or balance, but a both and balance between what I do and who I am. A balance that would allow me to keep all of my intensity and focus, and at the same time not lose sight of those things that were really important in my life. A balance that would allow me to take it all in till I was full to overflowing, and then with gratitude and with grace, to give it all back. To be like the sunset that nature graces us with every evening. To put it all out there, to publish it in my life, the very best I had to offer without any regard to whether it was received or not. I know that whenever I can do this, wonderful things happen. I photographed the Highland Games in Scotland for an advertising campaign for Doer Scotch. And we were photographing these huge guys throwing these weights around. And it was great fun, but I couldn't get my eye off the guy with the coat. He was the judge. And we shot some wonderful ads, but my intuition is just screaming at me to go meet this guy. So when it was over, I went up to him and I said, "Have you ever done this before? You're bigger than all the rest of these guys." And he said, "Aye, laddie, aye." I was the champion of Scotland for many years. And I said, well, what do you do now? And he said, well, I'm a farmer. I was a farmer then. I'm still a farmer now. I said, well, can I come and visit you? He said, well, I guess you could. So I dragged my whole crew down there the next day, and big boy. And we found this weight, that he hadn't thrown in years, and we took him out in his front field and talk about being your own banquet. He was just lost in the very best that he had to offer. And so was I. I mean, I didn't care if I was getting paid or shooting for doers. I was just falling in love through the lens, celebrating what's right with the world. And the art director took those pictures and turned them into this ad that said, for 25 years, Henry Gray won the cheers of the crowd at Scotland's Highland Games. And even now, he likes to get out and throw his weight around in the privacy of his own backyard. This ad won all kinds of awards, but I didn't care. I got to meet Henry. And a couple years later, we were back in Scotland and near where Henry lived. And so we stopped and we went over to his house. He showed us how he'd framed up the ad that we'd sent him. And he and his wife came out in the front yard and posed for pictures. And then he said, come here, laddie, I want to show you something. And he turned that ad around and it was covered with signatures. And I said, Henry, what's this? And he said, well, laddie, I ran that ad all over the world. And all of my relations in New Zealand and Australia and the US, they all saw it. They all called and they said, Henry, is that you? And I said, aye, it's me. And they said, well, we think we better come back and check on you. And so because of that ad, they had the first Grey Clan reunion in more than 200 years. We never know where it's going to go when you publish it in your life, when you give it all back. You just have to do it and believe.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute. So hopefully you're right. We were just evaluating that, by the way. It wasn't for educational purposes. But isn't that a great video? I love how it talks about how it's really our vision and our perspective shapes our vision, shapes our perspective, and our perspective shapes our reality, right? It shares a little bit from what we were talking about last week with cognitive behavioral therapy, is that we're changing our cognitions and then that changes our emotional reaction. But solution focused takes it a step further and says, you know what, we're not even focused in on the problems, the irrational thoughts, all of that. What we want to do is change perspective, because when we change perspective, we can then rewrite our reality to be focused on the solutions and where we want to go as opposed to where we are. So let me share my PowerPoint with you, and we're going to talk through that for a few moments. All right, great. There we go. We already watched the video. So the basic underlying assumption of solution focused, and really actually solution focused and narrative, but we won't talk about narrative in this lecture, is this idea of social constructivism, is that there's not one object reality. Rather, our perceptions are based on our own experiences, interactions with society, and social learning, right? Is so that when we are perceiving who we are in the world, it is based on our own perception, not necessarily based on anyone else's reality. So this is really important, because when we start talking about how to make change and focus on how to make solutions to get us from where we are now to where we want to be, it is all about us changing our perceptions as opposed to changing necessarily situations or focusing on problem solving, which is really what up until now we have focused on in each theoretical perspective, is this idea of problem solving. Or focusing in on the problem and understanding it and understanding where it came from, the etiology of the problem. Solution focus says, hey, guess what? We don't really need to do that. The more we focus on solutions and where we're going, the less problems will impact our lives. Okay, so the basic principle here is that we focus in on solutions. So interestingly enough, what does that look like in therapy? Here it is, okay? So a couple comes in and they are wanting to pursue marriage counseling because they are having trouble in their marriage, they're not communicating, they're on the brink of divorce, right? The solution-focused therapist would say, what do you want your marriage to look like? Well, I don't want us to fight, and I want our communication to be better. I want us to be able to be intimate. Right? And they focus on all of those. What would it look like if the problems were gone? Okay, so you outline all of those things, and then you come up with ways to get them to those things that they identified. Never do we say, oh, well, what's the problem? Well, communication. Okay, well, let's talk about that communication problem and how can we resolve that problem and how will we problem solve this problem? And no, instead we say, what would it look like if this problem wasn't there? And then we develop a path to be able to move towards a situation and a perspective where that problem is no longer impacting our behavior. Okay, so equifinality, what that means is that there are many, many paths that lead to the same outcome. Many paths lead to the same final outcome. And so the reason that we really associate that with solution-focused brief therapy is because when we're looking at solutions, there's not just one path to a solution, right? It could be that one small change, one small solution impacts the entire system and has a greater impact on everyone. So we really want to focus in on that there are many paths that can make enough of a change that the person could get to the outcome that they want, right? There's not one way of doing this. The other piece of this is that in solution focus, we don't say that problems are really indicative of any kind of pathology, right? We really externalize the problem from the individual. People experience transitions. They experience hiccups and issues along the road of life, the journey of life. Everybody's going to experience those. And when someone comes in and is experiencing some kind of issue, that shouldn't be looked at as, well, there's some sort of pathology that's making it so that they can't resolve that issue. Rather, that is the norm of life, right? Sounds a little existential, doesn't it? That is the norm in that we can externalize what the problem is so that the problem is not defining the person, but rather the problem is just the problem. And the person is experiencing this issue outside of just them, right? So you are not your problems. You're not defined by your problems, but rather they're things that are occurring in your life. So the problem is outside of the individual. If the client is not successful in solving problems, they often tend to start feeling stuck. And when you feel stuck, you are less apt and motivated to find solutions, right? When you're feeling stuck, it's really hard to kind of take your eyes up a little bit more and say, here's some possible ways to deal with this. Instead, we kind of feel stuck in the moment, like nothing's going to help. Nothing's gonna, and that's what happens when we focus in on the problem, is we actually generate more problem thinking by focusing in on the problem. Whereas if we focus in on the solution, we will generate more solution focused thought patterns and behaviors, which will then strengthen people's ability to generate solutions, and then it will become a cyclical situation. The other piece of solution focus, these are just the basic principles, is that change is inevitable. We're always changing. Things won't stay the same. The way that we're feeling right this moment, we will not necessarily feel that way in 24 hours or in a week or in maybe 10 minutes, right? Is that our feelings are just that. They're always changing. Situations are changing. So sometimes just kind of sitting with where we're at naturally will progress to change occurring. So if we want to facilitate change, we focus on solutions of where we want to go. Again, not on the problem. One thing you will hear over and over again with solution-focused brief therapy is the idea that if it's working, there's no need to fix it, okay? It kind of stands to reason and makes a lot of logical sense. If something's working for someone, then we don't need to go on some sort of psychological expedition to try to draw out and figure out why this is the way it is. If it's working for them, then just leave it be, okay? I like to use that example. I know I used it before of, if you're anxious when you wait in line at the store, well, then don't go to the grocery store at 5 o'clock, right? That's very behavioral. But again, if going to the grocery store at 2 in the morning works for you, then maybe we don't need to explore why it is that you're anxious getting in lines and how to resolve that underlying anxiety. Maybe you just go to the grocery store if it works for you at 2 in the morning. Okay, so if it isn't broken, we don't want to necessarily jump in and try to fix something just for the sake of saying, oh, well, I just don't want you to be anxious anytime, right? Maybe if it's working for the client, we should just leave it the way it is. Now, if it's not working for the client, that's when we start looking for solutions. Okay, so the key element here in solution-focused brief therapy is the client is always the expert. If we're talking about their perceptions of problems and situations, then really their perception is their own, and there's no way for us to be the expert on their perception. So we're dealing in a realm where it's very focused on the client's perceptions and them making change based on their perceptions. We focus in, just like that video was talking about what's going right in a person's life. So clients, again, they might come in and say, my marriage is falling apart. Okay, well, what is going right in your marriage? Oh, well, and then you can discuss that, and they might be able to identify some things that are going right. They might be able to identify exceptions to the problem. That's really what we want to look for. And the reason that we're looking for that is because if we can find exceptions to the problem, and then we can say, well, can you do more of that, right? Then they are going to have a more positive outcome. So if a couple's counseling, they come in and they say our marriage is falling apart, and we say, wait, okay, so now tell me one thing what's going right in your relationship. And they say, well, even though we really struggle with communication, we're still intimate. And so then you can build on that. Okay, so maybe we need to be intentional about times to be intimate, or maybe we need to be intentional about that thing that's going right, to do more of that. It's a little bit about that if we can increase what's going right, and we can change the perspective from a problem-centered focus to here's some solutions and things that you could do to make it go right, then we will naturally change behavior, okay? We're not interested in this theory about the etiology of why things are the way they are. Never will you see in solution focus that we are focusing in on understanding the problem and where it's coming from, other than to be able to identify the solution to the problem. So it really flips therapy completely on its side and says, nope, not going to focus on the problem. This kind of makes sense, though, because when you think about it, have you ever had a time where you focused in on a problem, right? It's like you just talk to everybody that called you, and you're like, oh, you're not going to do that, right? And you just talk about that, and then the next person calls, and they're like, hey, how's your day? And you're like, oh, guess what happened to me, right? How do you feel when you, in some ways, just ruminate about the problem, right? You stay in that place of negativity where you get deeper and deeper into how unfair and frustrating and upsetting it is, right? But if you focus on the solution and think, okay, this happened, but what I really want to have happen in this situation is this. And how could I get to that? Well, maybe I could approach it differently, or maybe I could try this. And you start coming up with almost instilling a level of hope that you can make a small change in the situation that could result in a systematic change, an outlook on the entire problem. Okay. So again, we're encouraging clients to understand what he or she did differently when they weren't experiencing problems. So when we start talking about solution focus, we start talking about some specific things. We're going to talk about the miracle question. We'll talk about that in a minute, but exceptions to the problem. And so we ask very specifically, have you ever had a period in your life when you weren't experiencing this problem? And what were you doing then? Right? Again, not focus on the problem, but the solutions of what was different when you weren't experiencing this symptom or the situation. What was different and what were you doing then? Because maybe if we can identify what you were doing then and do more of that, then the problem will naturally progress to decrease in your symptoms. So the goal of therapy then is always, always, always to change perspective. Okay. It is not to change cognition, like in CBT, or necessarily change behavior, like in behavior therapy, or to change ego strength, like in psychoanalytic, right? Or to self-actualize, like in person-centered, but rather it is to help the client change perspective. Because when perspective changes, then the person is able to make change to move towards their new perspective on the situation and their goals. So if we change perspective, we oftentimes can set goals and move towards that perspective and that change. So to change perspective, we look at what is occurring and help the client to see themselves as capable of making change. Remember, change is always happening. So if we can inspire the client to hope that they can make change and then be able to identify what the client is doing and what they could be doing to make a change in the situation, then they are moving towards solutions. Okay, so what techniques do we use? Did you notice that, like, on your templates, not that you're not doing a template this week, but if you were to be doing a template and you were to say the etiology of problems, in solution focused, we don't focus on the problem, right? The etiology of the problem then becomes that we are focused on the problem and not focused on the solutions, right? So hopefully that makes sense. So what we do is we start helping people move towards solution-oriented talk. Well, I could do this. I could possibly. Where I want to go is, and in order to get there, I need to, right? I want to have a thriving relationship. Well, in order to have a thriving relationship, I need to be able to communicate better. Okay, so what can you do to communicate better? Well, I can listen before I just explode, or I can take a break. Maybe I'm an extreme introvert and it's not best for me to address emotional things when I've just been around people and I'm exhausted. I need to have a little downtime before, I need processing time before I address an issue. Maybe all of those are solutions, right? Okay, so one of the things we look at is pre-session change. This is one of my very favorite questions, is that oftentimes folks will come in and they'll tell all these symptoms that they're having, like, they're depressed and they cry every day and they feel like nothing's ever going to change, and they just are so down, and they don't feel like getting out of bed. And if you ask them, well, how come the problem's not even worse? It kind of stops them in their tracks and they're thinking, wait, hold on a second. Like, okay, so the problem could be worse. And what is it that I'm doing now that is making it so that it's not worse? that's something that really gets people thinking, like, okay, so maybe there is something right now in this midst of feeling completely helpless and hopeless. Maybe there's something small that I am doing that is making the problem not get any worse. And if there is something small that I'm not doing, then maybe I can do more of that, and then the problem will get even better, right? So also, we talk about pre-session change. This one is a really fun one because I think we've all done this at some point. Have you ever made a decision that you're going to do something? And as soon as you make the decision that you're going to do it, you feel better, right? Like, here's my example. The beginning of the year, we make a New Year's resolution that we are going to exercise, right? Have you ever been there? Come on, you know you have. We are going to exercise. And so you join the gym and you feel great. You're like, yes, I am moving in the right direction. And so you sort of get the psychological benefit of the fact that you have made a plan, right? Pre-session change. Now, whether you ever make it to the gym is a whole nother question, okay? But the mere fact that you made some change, you pursued something, you put your foot in the right direction, oftentimes will have a positive impact on our mood, right? Okay, so my example of this too is every time I've ever gone into therapy during transitions in my life, I am so solution focused that I just make the call. And then as I'm waiting for my appointment, I like figure out an entire plan on how I'm gonna restructure things. I'm gonna do more self-care. I'm gonna do whatever it is that I need. And I get there and my therapist will say to me, so what have you done? And I'll tell her and she'll be like, okay, so what do you need me to do? And I'll be like, absolutely nothing. Like, all I really needed was to make the appointment, to hold me accountable, to get everything done before I even got here. And then I'm good to go. Happens every time, okay? But that's oftentimes what clients are doing. And they just need us to draw attention to, hey, what have you done? Since you made your appointment, how have you felt? What have you done differently, right? The other piece is this exception-oriented question. Again, we're not focusing in on the problem. We're focusing in on when was this problem not as prominent for you, and what were you doing then? When was this not an issue? Oh, well, 10 years ago, I wasn't feeling so depressed. Well, what were you doing then? Well, I was interacting with people a lot more, and I had friends, and I was active, and right? Okay, so if those are those things, could we increase those solutions and see if the symptoms decrease? The miracle question, right? Many of you probably have heard about the miracle question in the past, and this is a great question to use with clients. You'll see mixed research on how effective the miracle question actually is. From a clinical perspective, when I've used this, it's been very, very helpful. I'm not sure that the research reflects how effective it truly is. There's mixed reviews on that. But the miracle question is, if you were to go to bed tonight and you woke up in the morning and this problem, whatever they identify as the reason they're coming in, just miraculously went away, how would you know that the problem was gone? Okay, so sometimes folks will say, well, I just feel so depressed, or I'm so anxious. How would you know? Let's say it went away completely and you woke up tomorrow morning. How would you know that you weren't depressed and anxious anymore? And to be able to identify what symptoms would be gone, right? What you would actually be doing if those symptoms weren't there. If you were doing those things, what would that look like? And then can we identify ways for you to start integrating that into what you're doing now, even though the problem's still here, okay? Another way to ask this, sometimes folks have challenges identifying how things would be different. So sometimes we backdoor the miracle question in by saying, you were to go to bed tonight, you were to wake up tomorrow morning, and the problem was gone. What would be the first thing that your family noticed about you so that they knew that there was a change, right? And so sometimes, again, that sort of externalizes the problem a bit, and then people can reflect on that. So I had a client who came in and was dealing with some severe depression. And we talked about this, like, what would it look like if your depression was completely gone? And so she identified, she was like, well, I would get up in the morning and it wouldn't be such a struggle to get out of bed. And I would probably talk to my friends more. And I would probably engage in more activities with a wider group of people. We started talking about all these different things. And I said, okay, so could you just pretend for 10 minutes a day that you don't have any of these depressive symptoms? Just, I know they're there and they're very real, but I just want you for 10 minutes a day to pretend that they weren't there. So off she went, and that week she did it every day, 10 minutes, just pretend like, okay, if I wasn't depressed, this is what I would be doing. And then she engaged in those activities and just pretended that she wasn't. And she came back in, and she was very successful in being able to pretend for 10 minutes. So we said, okay, can you pretend each day for 20 minutes that you're not depressed and anxious? And so she worked on that. She continued this process until finally she got up to like 6 hours a day that she pretended that she wasn't depressed. And then she came into therapy and she's like, hey, so I realized something. If I can pretend for 6 hours, I can actually control how I'm feeling. And if I can control how I'm feeling, then I can change how I'm feeling. And she was able to resolve many of her symptoms just simply by faking it till she made it, right? Pretending, and then realizing, because it was so empowering to her, that she was actually able to impact how she was feeling. Okay, so scaling questions on a scale from 1 to 10. How challenging is this situation for you, right? So how debilitating is your anxiety? Well, it's an 8, okay? So what is one thing that you could do to bring that down just to a 7? And then you can work on some solutions on how to bring that down. And so you can use scaling questions that way, or you can also do this within one session. So you can say, okay, how distressing, a subjective unit of distress, how distressing is this particular symptom right now? You do that at the beginning of session with whatever they identify. And then you go through the whole session where you start talking about solutions and possibilities of things that they could do and their goals and where they want to go and what they want it to look like. And then at the end of the session, you say, okay, remember when we first came in, your anxiety was a 6. I'm wondering, now that we've gone through some of these solutions and talked about some possibilities, where is it right now? And it's making it very concrete for clients to be able to see the change that is occurring with any particular symptom. So one of the critiques, and I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of this, is that it is superficial in some ways, right? It relieves symptoms in the moment, and but does it address the underlying reason that the symptoms popped up in the first place? No, it doesn't. But it also is very effective for people because they can learn to focus in on ways to manage something, right? The solutions, and then aren't as impacted by the symptoms. So, but it doesn't sort of delve into our personality in some way. It doesn't look at necessarily past experiences in some way. It just simply looks at the current situation and solutions that might be helpful in that. We also have to be very careful that with this, we don't just use this kind of positive thinking that denies or minimizes the relevance or importance of a problem, right? So interestingly enough, there's been a lot of research coming out more and more now on using solution focus and particularly narrative therapy with trauma victims, which is somewhat surprising, only because, again, it doesn't really go back into like trauma narrative and those kinds of things. But there has been some success with that. The key to that is that we wouldn't want to minimize or sort of just gloss over a situation and minimize the impact that, say, a sexual trauma or something like that, an incident that happens, we wouldn't want to gloss over that and just pretend as if it did not happen. We want to make sure that in that situation that we do attend to the impact that that might have had on the person, and then take a growth perspective of where are we going from here. So it just needs to be handled with care so that it's not a situation where we are minimizing the impact of the problem. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because I'm going to post another video on narrative therapy later in the week. But hopefully between that video, you should watch it over and over again because it's so good. And this lecture gives you kind of like a firm foundation in understanding how solution focused is very different than any of the other perspectives that we have talked about thus far. All right. If you have questions, let me know, and there'll be another video coming on narrative shortly. All right, take care.